Well, okay, so we've got the cultural relativism, the theory. We have the consequences that it seems reasonable to consider being unsavory and you not want to do it. But what's the motivation to be a cultural relativist? Where does the idea come from? Well, it comes from among other places, the cultural differences argument. Okay. If people's moral judgments differ from culture to culture, moral standards are relative to culture. In other words, there are no objective moral standards. People's moral judgments differ from culture to culture. Therefore, moral standards are relative to culture. In other words, there are no objective moral standards. This is an argument for cultural relativism. Okay, so let's flash back to our logic stuff. What form of argument is this? If you said a modus ponens argument, you are correct. Okay, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Okay, so this is a modus ponens argument, which means it's a valid argument. Now that we know it's a valid argument, we have to examine what? Hopefully you said the premises. Once we examine the premises, we determine if they are true or not. If we can prove that premise 1 or premise 2 is not true, then the argument will fail. If we can't, if premises 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion will have to be true as well. So let's look at our premises. First, let's look at premise number 1. If people's moral judgments differ from culture to culture, moral standards are relative to culture. I want you to remember, I think I talked about this in the logic section, I want you to remember that our if-then statements are statements that are meant to draw connections between two things. Okay? An if-then statement in and of itself doesn't say either of the clauses are true. To say if P then Q does not say that P or Q is true. It just says there's a connection between P and Q. So if P is true, the connection will require that Q is true as well. So premise number 1 says, if people's moral judgments differ from culture to culture, moral standards are relative to culture. In other words, there are no objective standards. So it's saying that if people disagree, there is no answer. But I want you to consider if that connection's a good one. In my face-to-face classes, when I do this, I ask students when the first Thanksgiving was. Okay? Just randomly, I'll call on students and I'll say, when is the first Thanksgiving? And I make them give me an answer, whether they claim to know the answer or not. I make them give me an answer and I don't let them look it up. So I get various answers because, surprisingly, not a lot of people actually know when the first Thanksgiving was. Some people will say 1550, some people will say 1722, some people say 1645, okay? I've got 3 answers, and I'm like, okay, so you all have given me the 3 of you have given me three different answers to when the first Thanksgiving is. We have a disagreement, okay, because they are, of course, very married to their answer. We have a disagreement. Does the fact that there's disagreement mean that there's no answer? Doesn't seem like it, right? It seems like the fact that there's disagreement simply means there's disagreement. Once upon a time, there was disagreement over whether the earth was round. Once upon a time, there was disagreement over whether the sun moved around the earth or whether the earth moved around the sun. But there was an answer. So premise number 1 is drawing a connection between the existence of a disagreement and there not being an answer to the question. And that connection doesn't seem like a good one. Okay? So the objection, the first objection to the cultural differences argument is that premise 1 is not obviously true. Okay? Premise 1 is saying if there's disagreement, then there's no answer. But the fact that there's disagreement doesn't mean there's no answer. It could be the case that there is disagreement and there still is an answer. Okay? So the fact that there's disagreement does not entail that there's no answer. In other words, it is not the case if P, then Q, where focus on my P's and Q's right here. Okay? Does that make sense? It's just not obviously true that premise 1 is true.